Thanks for joining us on the weekly AJA Zoom event. This is our first event for the year, and we've got a great lineup of speakers for you. My name is Robert Gregory, and tonight we're very honoured to have as a guest Australia's longest-serving Foreign Minister, Alexander Downer. AJA President Dr. David Adler will ask Mr. Downer some questions, and then you'll have a chance to ask some questions. If you'd like to ask a question, the best way is to raise your hand with the reaction button. Written questions can also be placed on the chat function, and if we get a chance, we may get to some. This session is being broadcast on Zoom, on Facebook, as well as on J-Air Community Radio. Mr. Downer was Minister for Foreign Affairs from 1996 to 2007 under the Howard government. He was also High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 2014 to 2018. He's also been a UN envoy, a leader of the Liberal Party, as well as a visiting professor, amongst several other roles. Lately, Mr. Downer has been outspoken in condemning anti-Semitism, and he's made some particularly strong criticisms of the Greens. So, Alexander Downer, thank you so much for joining the AJA tonight.
Well, Alexander, I'll ask you some things, hopefully not too probing, and firstly, I want to thank you so much for joining us. We characterise your current role as being a bit like an elder statesman, a commentator. Is that a fair description of what you're doing at the moment? You're writing things. I see you appear on television occasionally, and we have the privilege of hearing from you this evening. So, elder statesman, commentator.
Well, I do quite a lot of commentary. I have a fortnightly column in the Australian Financial Review, which I've had actually for quite some years, since 2018. And I do interviews in the media from time to time. I'm the director of a number of companies. I'm the chairman of two things. One of them is a company in Australia called Gold Hydrogen, which is a hydrogen company, as its name suggests. And the other chairmanship I have is over in the UK, where I am at the moment. I'm the chairman of a think tank called Policy Exchange. We like to call it Europe's leading centre-right think tank, but in any case, that's what it is. It's a very sophisticated and frankly pretty well-funded think tank. So I'm the chairman of that. But then I'm on other boards and have advisory roles and so on. So I have a few things to do.
Well, we're grateful you could join us. Now, a few weeks ago, I reached out to you, and we did a recorded interview, which is on our YouTube channel for those that would like to see it. And the thing that caused me to reach out to you specifically, I'll put on the screen now. And these were your words in describing the Australian Greens. The underlining and the graphic is ours, but the words are yours. I used to think the Greens were just an extremist environmental party, but now I've realised they're much worse. They're an anti-Semitic cult. No civilised person should forget that come the next election. They should be electorally wiped out. They're horrific. Now, we don't disagree with a word, but what prompted you to make such a strong, outspoken comment about the Australian Greens?
It was their instinctive condemnation of Israel, of the Israeli Defence Force, of the Israeli government after the events of the 7th of October. You would have thought that any political party would have expressed outrage about the events of the 7th of October, what happened to those people, demand the release of the hostages, and say that Hamas need to surrender the hostages and give Israel guarantees of security. It's as simple as that. The war would end overnight if that happened. But the Greens, instinctively, they just condemned the Israelis. They didn't care what happened on the 7th of October. They have continued with a number of different stunts, walking out of the parliament and that sort of thing, ever since. So they're not environmentalists, so they profess to be concerned about the environment. This is an extremist, far-left radical movement, which, like much of the so-called progressive left, as they like to call themselves nowadays, the far left, they are deeply anti-Semitic. We saw that in the UK with Jeremy Corbyn and his faction of the British Labour Party, not the Labour Party generally, but his faction of the British Labour Party. We see that in the Greens in Australia, and you can see that in parts of the far left in the United States, including the three presidents of those august universities, two of whom mercifully have lost their jobs. I mean, what it exposes, what the behaviour of all of these people exposes, is a deep underlying anti-Semitism, a standard that is applied to the Israelis that isn't applied to anyone else. And you can't put it down to anything else. So the Greens, you know, they're the leader of this in Australia. And the fact that the Greens are so anti-Semitic needs to be called out. And they need to be challenged. And they need to be, as I said in that tweet, they need to be defeated at the next election.
Well, we're certainly on side with such an outcome. But one of the things that shocked us, and I guess it's sort of related, and you will have seen some of this, I'm sure, is the dramatic rise in anti-Semitic incidents locally in Australia. By some reports, a sevenfold increase, but also the seriousness. We've seen numerous threats, assaults. Every day we're getting reports of incidents. What do you think the government's response has been like? How would you rate it, and what should the government be doing?
Well, the government should crack down on this as best, or governments, because it does include the responsibility of state governments as well. They, after all, are responsible for the criminal law in the main. So they should. So it's easy to say they should crack down on this, but they should make sure that this sort of behaviour is completely unacceptable. So we don't want a government or any governments which are pushing out mixed messages. And I suppose my criticism of the government is that sometimes they, particularly the federal government, I don't know enough about each of the individual state governments, but the federal government is sending out mixed messages. You know, at times it expresses concern about these events of the 7th of October, says Israel has a right to defend itself, but then are full of buts. And quite a lot of criticism and condemnation of the Israelis, and that it's what they haven't done. So I would have, if I'd been the foreign minister, I would have joined with the Americans and the British. I mean, I wouldn't have had to be persuaded by the Americans and the British to condemn the South African attempt to take the Israelis to the International Court of Justice, and made it perfectly clear I regarded that as a complete abuse of international process, and brings into disrepute the International Court of Justice, using it in that sort of political way. Anyway, there's all sorts of history to why the South Africans do that. But the government, being the Australian government, has not been quick to condemn that. They just shrugged their shoulders and said, well, the law must take its course, or that kind of line. So I think, and then Penny Wong didn't go and visit the sites of the horrors of the 7th of October in the south of Israel. So they're sending out mixed messages. And the trouble with that, going back to your question, the trouble with that is not that it legitimizes anti-Semitism, but it is not taking a hard line against it. It is not having it's not providing very crystal clear leadership. It looks as though it's trying to manage what I can see their supporters in the media describe as a difficult political issue. I wouldn't have thought it was difficult. I would have thought it was quite clear And it's difficult if you're trying to balance the votes of the Greens and the left of the Labour Party and stop the hemorrhaging of votes in inner city suburbs from Labour to the Greens. That is difficult. But this is not this should not, I mean, I can see it is, but this should not be about that. This should be a crystal clear issue of good versus evil. It's as simple as that. And Australia should unequivocally be on the side of good. And anybody who understands the history of the world just take any sweep, but over the last century, would, I thought, have some clarity about what positions Australia should take here. So, I mean, it's not that the government is, the federal government is anti-Semitic. It's just that they send out mixed messages. And by sending out mixed messages, that means that when people are engaging in anti-Semitic rants, well, they sort of shrug their shoulders, metaphorically speaking. And of course, allowing people to make the kind of anti-Semitic denunciations can in turn lead on to violence, and we've seen a couple of incidents of that.
Now, you mentioned that Penny Wong didn't go to the south of Israel. We have been highly critical of that decision, and we know people in Israel who interpreted it as quite an insult, because the leaders of other countries who visited, Anthony Blinken and UK and EU representatives, Simon Birmingham, went south. So I've got to ask you a loaded question. Would Foreign Minister Alexander Downer have gone to the south of Israel?
Of course. I mean, I wouldn't have even thought about it. It wouldn't have been a question of debate in my head, or I don't know what the department would have thought, but I just have no idea. But in my head, it wouldn't have been a matter of debate. Of course, instinctively, I would have gone there. I want to see the sites of where these horrific acts occurred, and acts which inevitably and obviously would trigger a war. So I would want to go and see them. But, you know, I've made the point. I think it's really important people understand this. The Albanese government is about politics. And here, it's not about the Liberal Party that they're concerned, it's the Greens. So this anti-Semitic cult, euphemistically called the Greens, they have been taking votes from Labour in particularly inner cities, Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. And the Labour Party is worried about the continual march of the Greens in those electorates.
Right, okay.
Electorates held by none less than Tanya Plibersek and Anthony Albanese. So that's what they're worried about. And so they want to, as they would see it, get the balance right on this issue. That means the political balance. That means they're using this issue to manage what they see as a difficult political situation. So Penny Wong, from the left of the Labour Party, done quite a good job in that portfolio in some respects, I think, particularly in the South Pacific. So I don't want to sound as though I'm a liberal and thinks everything Labour has done is wrong. I mean, sometimes they've done quite good things. But when it comes to an issue like this, coming from the left of the Labour Party, she wants to make sure votes don't hemorrhage from Labour to the Greens. So that is what motivates her.
Tell me if other people have also said that there is now a significant Islamic bloc in Australia, approximately 1 million, close to 1 million people, according to the census, in at least between 15 and 20 electorates. That is an influential bloc. Do you think that's also now starting to exert an effect on the policy profile of the Labor Party?
I mean, sure. I mean, it's a difficult thing to say, but it's been their decision. Muslim Australians have, I mean, they can vote for who they like, as everybody in Australia can. But overwhelmingly, they vote Labor, and some of them vote Green. And they are quite substantial, quite a substantial block of votes in electorates in southwest Sydney, for example, parts of Melbourne. And in electorates like Tony Burke's electorate, they're very much taking into account those communities. So when I talk about the risk of hemorrhaging votes from the Labors, as they see it, risk of hemorrhaging votes to the Greens, a lot of those votes would be Muslim Australians. Yeah. Who, I mean, I'm not sure why Muslim, just because you're a Muslim, you would hate Israel and hate the Jews. But anyway, there seems to be some correlation there.
There is a correlation. That's another subject which we could spend hours on, and we do. But when you were in government, Alexander, most of the policy, correct me if I'm wrong, but most of the policy related to Israel seemed reasonably bipartisan. It was, you know, there might have been some things around the edges, but there wasn't a lot of disagreement on fundamentals. Since the election of the current Labor government, there's been a whole series of shifts. The removal of the limited recognition of Jerusalem, the change in terminology from disputed to occupied territories was introduced by Penny Wong. The UN voting pattern has changed. We now no longer vote with our major allies necessarily on Israel-related matters at the UN. Foreign aid has been increased significantly to UNRWA and other entities which are not friendly to Israel. What do you think is going on there with all those policy changes, and have we seen the end of bipartisanship?
I think the end, who knows, but I think for the time being, under Albanese and Wong and so on, I think it's not true of all Labor MPs, by the way, but I think we have seen the end of bipartisanship, for the time being. I don't know. Sometime in the future, Labor could swing back to their more traditional positions, but for the time being, no, they have become hugely critical of Israel. And this goes back to before their last election, though, because when the Morrison government was considering switching recognition of the capital of Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, the Labor Party was very critical of that. And even in the time when I was the foreign minister, Kevin Rudd, who was the shadow minister for foreign affairs, he would quite often criticize me because the Labor Party didn't approve of our votes in the United Nations. So I would say this is something that has happened over time. It's gradually happened. It hasn't suddenly happened, that the Labor Party has become increasingly hostile to Israel. I've been through what I think are the explanations. I mean, it is true. There are a large number of Muslim branch members in the Labor Party. That has definitely been a factor. The worry about hemorrhaging votes to the Greens has been another worry for the Labor Party. I mean, if you look at their polls at the moment, the Labor Party's primary vote sort of back to, I think, roughly speaking, back to where it was at the last election, which was one of the lowest primary votes the Labor Party's had ever, and in a federal election. And but they still win the election because of the preferential voting system. And a lot of those votes have gone to the Greens. So this is a huge worry for them as they see it in terms of political management. So I think all of these things have played into a shift in the Labour Party's position, not to gainsay the fact that there are people on the left of the Labour Party like Penny Wong who are no doubt very sincere in their passionate criticism of Israel.
Yeah. Okay, can I ask you about two specific decisions? You'll be aware that late last year, Penny Wong announced something in excess of 860 visas would be issued to people in Gaza to come to Australia. We criticised that decision and on security grounds. On your experience, what's your view on issuing those visas and the speed at which it was done?
I think I don't want to be sort of too harsh about this, but I think they've made a whole series of extraordinary decisions which are based on politics, because I think this is a government which basically operates on the basis of political games. You wouldn't, I don't mind where people come from when they migrate to Australia, by the way. Their provenance is not the issue. Their personal behaviour, the contribution they can make to Australia, and that includes being satisfied that the appropriate security checks have been done. That's all important. So how could have the government done proper security checks on people coming from Gaza? I mean, did the Australian officials who are based in Ramallah, did they travel down to Gaza? And how do you check the security of people in Gaza? Who do you ask to check their security? How do you know? How do you know their backgrounds? How do you examine their backgrounds? And let's face it, we all know the government can't answer those questions. I mean, if I were an MP, if I were the Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs or the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, he's pretty active, by the way, the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs.
You're talking about James Patterson.
Yeah, James Patterson. Yeah. I would be asking all of those sorts of questions. I would love to know how they check the security of these people. It'd be very, very interesting. But the truth is they couldn't have done. So they're motivated by some other motive to bring them here. And I've been through all of that. It's politics.
Yes, you have. Even Israel, which probably knows a little bit more than Australia about the influences in the Middle East, when it issued its work permits to enable people from Gaza to come into southern Israel for jobs, that has currently been proved to have been greatly flawed. There were many hundreds that were quietly assisting Hamas, giving them photographs, information, plans, etc., which helped facilitate the 7th of October. So we're just shaking our heads on this issue, and I'm really, really worried that it is impossible that in that cohort there won't be some supporters of Hamas, maybe quite a lot of supporters of Hamas, and maybe even some that would be prepared to act physically, just based on the experience in the area. That's
the truth is that let's not walk away from this. When they last did have an election in Gaza, when was that? 2006, a long time ago. Somebody will correct me. I think it was 2006. The Israelis withdrew in 2005, and the public voted for Hamas. I would, and Hamas has been hugely popular.
Yes, still
hugely popular. And even now, you would have thought common sense, if you were a Gazan, common sense would tell you that this organization, Hamas, has brought a war to your front door they brought a war by what they did on the 7th of October, knowingly. Of course, when they launched that attack on the 7th of October, the leaders of Hamas knew that Israel would react. Of course they knew that. I give them credit. They're not silly. But these are theological ideologues, these people who run Hamas. So if I were an average Gazan, I would think, gosh, if we got these people out and instead of continually perpetrating violence against the Israelis and against Jewish people, we sat down and said, okay, we now want to talk about the two-state solution and diplomatically force the Israeli government into those negotiations. Whatever sort of coalition there may be in Israel, they would in the end have to engage in those negotiations. I would be able to go about my daily life in Gaza in peace. So therefore, I would like Hamas out of power, and I would like somebody more moderate and reasonable in power. But I don't see any, or I've seen a little bit of it, but I don't see much sign of that. I don't see much sign of that. I think there is huge support for what Hamas has done in Gaza. Understandably, a lot of criticism of the Israelis, but there is support for them. I mean, when I see, I'm in London at the moment, and when I see doctors, Hamas doctors, being interviewed on TV by the BBC, you know, they sort of are pretty much like Hamas, the BBC. When I see these interviews, the doctors talk about the victims and the lack of equipment and so on. Fair enough. But there's not a hint of criticism of Hamas and the horrors that Hamas has brought upon the people of Gaza. So I spent a lot of time talking about that because I think, you know, it's one thing to say Hamas are just a lot of, you know, terrible, criminal and ghastly theological people. It's one thing to say that. But it is worth remembering they have huge support from the people of Gaza.
They do.
It is really important to remember that.
There have been a couple of studies published where on the question of do you support what Hamas did on the 7th of October, and roughly 75% are saying yes. I just want to finish with one question, a little bit on the side of the area. Australia was asked to contribute to the coalition's effort in the Red Sea, securing the shipping against the attacks from the Houthis. And we have no military assets at all which have been committed. What's your view on what Australia's obligation and response should have been?
Australia is a significant country and has for many years been a significant contributor to what you might broadly call the Western Alliance, led by the United States, the great alliance of liberal democracies. And we should always understand, so it says there's this line, we need to concentrate on our own region. Well, hang on, what would happen if all the other members of the alliance said, well, you concentrate on your own region and we'll concentrate on ours. So by the way, you're on your own in your own region. And if anything happens to you or happens more realistically, happens in your region, I'm sure you can fix it up. But we've got other preoccupations. And imagine above all if Washington took that view. So that's not how an alliance works. An alliance is burden sharing. And there's a lot of burden here in the Red Sea. There's a lot, you need a lot of very sophisticated equipment to retaliate against the Houthis. So Australia sends out a message that actually we're not part of the global Western Alliance. We're just a regional country and we'll call on you when we need you. It's the wrong message for Australia. I mean, a once great and proud country, Australia, which has always prepared to make its contribution to a better world. We send 6 people And the government tries to pretend that we're making a contribution. We have 6 officers, ADF officers. I think it's 6 or somewhere between 6 and 16, whatever it is. I mean, don't insult us. You're not really making a contribution, and don't pretend the Navy doesn't have any ships. We've had ships rowed over many years, actually going all the way back to the Hawke government and the first Iraq War. We've had ships rotating through the Gulf, but suddenly we can't do it. I'm sorry, I just come back to my theme all along. I like governments of principle. I like the leaders of the country to show leadership, but I do not respect politicians who are put into positions of authority and power and use those positions just to play politics. So the decision not to send a ship there looks to me, you know, it's been a bit of a theme of this, well, I was going to say this evening, your time. It's been a bit of a theme of this evening. I think it's all about domestic politics in Australia. The reason we're not sending a ship. I mean, surely, even if the argument is true that we don't have, I mean, it seems incredible that the ADF doesn't have the capacity to shoot down drones. But even if we didn't, we could borrow that capacity from the Americans and the British, who clearly do have that capacity. But in any case, I don't believe the ADF doesn't have the capacity to shoot down drones. That's ridiculous. Of course they do. So I feel quite strongly about this. And I mean, it makes Australia look like a selfish ally. But yes, we would like you, the Americans, the British and so on, the French, Spanish and the like, to make a contribution in the Indo-Pacific region. And Australian diplomacy has focused very much on getting these countries to participate more in the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific region. But even when it comes to the Middle East, in this case, the Red Sea, 12% of global trade, maritime trade, passes through the Red Sea. Oh, no, I'm sorry, we're just too busy. I think it's been a very bad look. I mean, it makes Australia look weak and selfish.
Right. Okay, I'll finish there. I'm going to do our usual 1-minute promo, and then we'll open for questions. So as we do every week, I'd ask everyone to make sure you're doing something tangible to support AJA after the event. Please go to the website. If you're not yet a supporter, you can do so. You can sign up to the email list and make sure you follow us on the various social media platforms that you use. Next week, we're getting more into depth in the military issues, but looking specifically at Israel's military challenges with Yonah Jeremy Bob, who's the senior military correspondent and intelligence analyst with the Jerusalem Post. And so we'll get one of the most experienced Israelis knowledgeable on military intelligence to join us. Robert, do you want to look after question time, please?
Sure. All right, yes, I can see we've got hundreds of people watching across the different platforms, so a lot of questions, so everyone keep it very, very, very brief. We may have to skip to some people who haven't asked before, but Jeff, you're up first. Would you like to ask your question?
Shalom, Alexander. I noticed that you no longer mix with politicians, so you'll be able to tell us exactly what you think of this ungodly band of former Labor foreign ministers, including Bob Carr, Gareth Evans, Kevin Rudd, who was also foreign minister, Bill Hayden, who was also foreign minister, and so was Gough Whitlam, foreign minister, with his even-handed approach. Contrast this with the dream team led by your good person and Andrew Peacock, Percy Spender, and even Robert Gordon Menzies. What do you think of the former?
Okay, well, you missed out H.B. Evatt. Remember, he was the Labour.
Yes, I know. He was wonderful, wasn't he?
Right, at the time of he said he was a terrible leader of the opposition, and sort of, I mean, I think you could say that he went a bit mad towards the end, and even his fans say that. but he very much championed the creation of Israel in those early days of the United Nations. He was, I think I'm right in saying he was the president of the United Nations General Assembly at the time when it passed the resolution on the establishment of Israel. I think he was. So more recently, well, Bob Carr changed his position on the Middle East over the years. I mean, one of the problems here, so I'll be quick in just making this one point. One of the problems is that the progressive left have changed. They used to talk about, you know, the conditions of the working class and the need for higher wages and better conditions of employment and so on, and a class-based society, greater mobility for working class people. But now they're not into that. Now they're into critical theory. Society is bifurcated between the oppressed and the oppressors. There's no limit on the human rights abuses of the oppressor class, which is off limits for the progressive left. And the Israelis have, because they won the 48, 67, 73 wars, and they've proved to be such a successful, it's proved to be a hugely successful country. Because of that, they've now become seen to be oppressors, not the oppressed Jews of the 20th century, but the oppressors. And so they have lost all sympathy with Israel. There's no doubt about that. It's part of the new ideology of the new left. And the new left has become hugely divisive in its interpretation of the way society, including international society, works. And that explains why that list of, well, Bill Hayden, God bless his soul, we wouldn't include in that list, and maybe not Gough Whitlam, but Bob Carr, right? Bob Carr has gone the full Palestinian, you might say. Has been hugely hostile to Israel. So yeah, you've seen a big shift in the left.
Yeah, I think Bob Carr is a disaster. And whenever we see him comment on AJA or criticize us, we always know we're doing the right thing. Next up, we have Leon. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Good evening, Mr. Downer. Given that Palestinian Arab society, including the leadership and the populace generally, are very far from accepting the existence of Israel as being legitimate, is there any point in talking about a Palestinian state without reforming from top to bottom Palestinian Arab society? And do you agree that if such a state were to be established in any part of Judea and Samaria, it would just be creating another Hamas state?
I remember now Prime Minister Netanyahu, when he was in opposition, I had lunch with him in the Knesset one day, a few years ago now, and we were talking about the two-state solution. That's exactly the point he made. He said, well, you're asking us to have Iran established in Eastern Jerusalem. I don't think we're going to allow that. Yes, I mean, the answer to your question is there has to be substantial political change in the Palestinian territories before it's going to be possible to negotiate a two-state solution. I think, to be fair here, and it's really important to understand this, the moderate Arab states absolutely understand that, relatively moderate, from the Saudis through to the Emiratis, the Bahrainis, the Egyptians, the Jordanians. They understand that Hamas is, of course, completely unacceptable. Hamas is as much their enemy as it is Israel's enemy. They worry about Iran, those countries. And importantly, they would like to see the reformation of Palestinian politics. That's incredibly hard to do, because if you look at recent opinion polls of Palestinian opinion, So they hold the PLO, they hold the administration in Ramallah in a fairly high degree of contempt, by the way. Hamas does seem to be reasonably popular. And what else is there? So what for there to be, for the Israelis to have a negotiating partner, I mean, who do they negotiate? You can't have a negotiation with people who are just trying to kill you. You have to either be killed or make sure you deal with them. So the challenge for the Arabs, more generally for the Arab world, is to see what it can do about restructuring or helping to restructure the politics of the Palestinians. And when their Palestinians have a genuine authoritative leadership, which is prepared to sit down and negotiate a two-state solution with the Israelis, then that can be done. But, you know, you can't have that negotiation with Hamas. It's not going to happen. Or for that matter, with any other proxy of the Iranians, like Hezbollah or someone.
Yep. Norman Schuler, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Alexander.
Hello, Norman from Adelaide.
Yes. Now, the thing that I find the government has particularly let us down as a Jewish community is that there has been absolutely no renunciation of what took place in Sydney on October the 9th. And one has to think, are we really welcome here? Are we really wanted? And when push comes to shove, and there were a crisis, if there is a Labour government, where would we stand?
Well, Labour have, excuse me, Labour have driven themselves into a corner on this issue. I mean, of course, that chanting outside the Sydney Opera House should have been roundly condemned, and the police should have dispersed the crowd. This gets to this whole issue of multiculturalism. The government has to provide leadership here. I mean, it's not that I'm against multiculturalism, but what the government has to do is make it clear that there are some core Australian values. And you don't want people migrating to Australia, or the descendants of people who've migrated to Australia, bringing all the bitterness of the old world with them, and all the arguments of the old world, and establishing fights with other cultural groups in our country based on the disputes of history. They need to understand that there are some core values here in Australia, and one of them is tolerance, and it's a liberal democracy, support for our nation, national pride, all sorts of different things. But if you allow people to go around saying the sort of things that were said in Sydney at that time, or if you don't, you can't always stop an incident, but if you don't come out and roundly condemn it and make it perfectly clear that's outrageous and completely unacceptable, and it's, if you like, un-Australian, that's not the way Australians behave and should behave, well, then you're going to give license to more of that. You're going to give license to more of that sort of behaviour. So it comes back to what I'm saying. You don't want to be playing politics with this issue. You want to just make it clear there is a division between good and evil. What happened on the 7th of October was evil, and we don't ever want to see that happen again and be allowed to happen again. So it must be stopped. That must be quite simple, quite a simple point. But allowing people to go around saying gas the Jews and so on, it's just well, allowing it. Yes, the police just stand by. It's just horrendous. That's Australia. Those people who are saying that are either Australians and then they should be condemned for their un-Australian behaviour, or if they're not Australians, they should be deported. We don't want people in our country as visitors on visas who are behaving like that. They can go.
That's exactly what Peter Dutton said.
Yep. That's what I was just going to say, Peter. That's what Peter Dutton said, and that's
exactly.
what we'd agree with. And there's a couple of comments in the chat of people saying, they're seriously considering moving to Israel and things like that. So that should be very concerning for all Australians. Next up, we have Hugh. Would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Mr. Downer. I'm just down the road from you in Sussex.
Oh.
I'm an Aussie citizen living here in England. Anyway, my question's perhaps a slightly sensitive one. Here in Britain, the Foreign Office have absolute sway over the government of the day certainly when it comes to matters with Israel. And the issue of Israel's sovereignty over Jerusalem is a case in point. You're probably aware of where Britain stands on that. Does that same absolute sway of the Foreign Office or the Department of Foreign Affairs in Australia, do they have a similar sway over the government of the day and dictate foreign policy?
They have a similar point of view. They have the same point of view as the FCDO, as it's now called in London. And you're right. I mean, I actually, to be fair, I think the government of Rishi Sunak has been pretty good on all of this. I mean, they do have warships in the Red Sea, and they have been shooting down Houthi missiles, and they've been attacking Houthi sites. They have been pretty crystal clear, though they have been pretty crystal clear on the horrors of the 7th of October. They've been denouncing anti-Semitism in the UK. I think, to be fair, they've been pretty good. But your question's fine, because I know only too well. Remember, I was the Australian High Commissioner here for 4 years. The FCDO is pretty pro-Palestinian, and a lot of people in the FCDO are quite hostile to Israel. I know that. And this isn't universally true, as you know from Dave Sharma, but this is significantly the case with DFAT in Canberra. I mean, when I was the foreign minister, I remember this so well, and some of you have heard me say this before. When it came to votes in the UN, DFAT used to plead with me to abstain. Your votes in the UN on Israel used to plead with me to abstain, not to vote down the resolutions, because otherwise we wouldn't be in good company. And that's what they're interested in. And maybe we shouldn't, by our votes, alienate the Arab countries. Well, two things about that. One, I didn't want to vote in good company. I wanted to do the right thing with my votes. So I told them that we would vote according to the merits of the resolution. So we often voted just with 5 or 6 other countries, with America and Israel. Well, I call them good company. And, the Federated States of Micronesia and Nauru, or whoever it was, Guatemala or somewhere, and that was it. And everyone else would either abstain or vote for the resolution. But DFAT used to like that. They used to beg me. On one occasion, they rang me 10 minutes before a vote in the UN, the ambassador did, pleading with me that we abstain rather than vote against the resolution. No, I said, we'll vote against it. He rang me after the vote and said, it's very embarrassing, Minister. There are only 6, I think it was 6, only 6 of us who voted against the resolution. I said, well, that may be, but the resolution was wrong. So I'm glad we did the right thing. So, yeah, DFAT, not universally, as I say, Dave Sharma, you couldn't accuse him of any of that. And he was a DFAT officer. He worked in my office for several years, actually, Dave Sharma.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you so much for his votes. And yeah, Dave Sharm was a good friend of AJ, a good friend of the Jewish community, always doing good. Alan, you're up next. Would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Mr. Downer, Penny Wong has been articulating the same rather insincere messages of support for Israel that we have heard from many other countries. And it seems to me that what they're all saying is Israel is entitled to defend itself, but not too much. Am I being a bit oversensitive here? And if not, do you think it's that world opinion is largely disinterested in Israel's plight?
By the way, I think this is a huge problem, and I think it's a civilizational issue. This, I really do. You know, it's the old saying, first the Jews and then they'll get you. Don't you worry. It's worth remembering that. It's wise words. You would have thought we've been through the Second World War. People might have some vague recollection of what happened in the lead up to the Second World War. It was first the Jews and then it was everyone else. I think it is insincere of Western countries. I think they're just playing politics to say, well, the Israelis' response should be proportionate. What, they should take out the same number of Palestinians and do to them what was done to the Israelis. And that's proportionate, is it? I actually think there's a deeper issue here, and it's quite simple. Hamas wants to, I mean, people should explore what Hamas is. Hamas wants to destroy Israel and kill the Jews. Kill Jews. That's what Hamas wants to do. So I'm sorry, they just have to be militarily, because you can't in any other way, militarily, they just have to be destroyed. And they have been spending billions. They must have been spending billions of dollars on building this network of these tunnels, whatever it is, 360 kilometers or whatever of tunnels, which was money that I assume was intended for aid for the people of Gaza. But anyway, they've been building this whole military network, and that has to be destroyed. And once it's been destroyed, and once they have no military capability, then the Israelis will be safe. And they have to work out militarily how they do that. I'm awfully sorry to say that if the situation comes down to war, then a lot of people are going to be killed. And that is as simple as that. I'm very sorry that people are killed in wars. But in which case, my best advice as a former foreign minister is, if you don't want people to be killed in wars, don't start a war. Don't go into the neighboring country and massacre and rape and torture and kidnap people. Don't even think that that would be a good idea. Hamas wanted to start this war, and Israel has to win it. And that's why I say it's a civilizational issue. Israel has to win this war. There can be no compromise. And it doesn't matter for what political convenience the rest of the world says. The Israeli government just has to get, the Israeli Defense Force just has to get the war won. And they have to find the method to do that. I don't know how. Well, your next guest will be able to tell you how they're going. They seem to be doing quite well, is the impression I get, the Israeli Defense Force. But they just have to finish the job. And that should be the message coming out of the Australian government. I'm very, very sorry about the deaths of a lot of civilians, but the war shouldn't have been started in the first place. If you want to start a war with Israel, or if you wanted to start a war with Australia, I'm sorry, if you do start the war, we're going to win it. We're going to win it. And there will be a lot of casualties. So if you're worried about casualties, don't start a war.
Barry Shaw from Israel, you can ask your question. Barry? No, I guess for some reason Barry's not asking. Okay, who's next, Robert? Greg Hearn?
Hello, Mr. Downer.
Hi.
I've been looking at Hezbollah, Hamas. They all seem to have links to the Muslim Brotherhood. And my question is, when our governments, our Western governments, are making decisions and wanting to understand the ideas behind these organisations and political Islam in particular, who do they listen to? Who are their advisors on political Islam? From your experience.
Yeah, well, it's a very good question. So Hezbollah and Hamas are Shia and Sunni, respectively. So Hezbollah listen first and foremost to their masters in Tehran. They're very, very driven by the Iranians. Hamas are supported by the Iranians, of course, but not to the extent that Hezbollah are. And the Iranians support Hamas because Hamas is part of what they like to call more broadly the resistance. And so they feel they must support the resistance wherever it is, whether they're Shia or whether they're Sunni. So Hamas, as somebody mentioned earlier, grew out of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it is, I mean, people just don't look into this. They should look into what Hamas is about, the statements their leadership have made, and they should take them seriously. They should take seriously what their leaders have said. They want to drive the Jews out of Jerusalem, of course, and drive the Jews out of the whole region. And they want to establish a theocracy and a caliphate. That is what they want to do. And this is sort of part of the ideology of the Muslim Brotherhood. So this isn't just a few restless Palestinians who are craving for attention and demanding that Netanyahu and his government negotiate with them. That's not what these people are about. And yet, you know, a lot of the demonstrators and the critics of Israel seem to think that this is just, you know, born out of frustration. This is not born out of frustration. This violence is born out of an ideological commitment to achieve ultimately a caliphate. So the Arab leadership, whether it be Mohammed bin Salman or President Sisi in Egypt, or the king of Jordan, wherever it is, they don't like Hamas because they can, and they certainly don't like Hezbollah because they can see not only Iran's fingerprints all over it, but they can also understand the extremist ideological nature of Hamas. So they privately, they want the Israelis to succeed in defeating Hamas. They certainly don't want to see Hamas be successful, and they certainly don't want to see a rise in support for Hamas and therefore for the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. They absolutely don't want to see that, or, and very importantly, in Saudi Arabia, where MBS is making a whole series of different reforms, and some of which are being resisted by the, you know, hardcore Wahhabists and the allies of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's important to put all of these pieces together and understand how all of this works when looking at the whole issue. So I look at those demonstrators in Western capitals, in London, in Melbourne, or wherever they happen to be, and I just think, gosh, you just have no idea. You have no idea what you are supporting. You have no idea of the dangerous cause you're supporting. Even Arab leaders think you're balmy supporting people like Hamas and Hezbollah, and empowering increasingly empowering the ideology of the Iranian regime and the footprint of the Iranian regime. But, you know, the demonstrators is an issue for another day. The people who say from the river to the sea, and you ask them what river and what sea, and they say, oh, well, is it the Black Sea or the Red Sea? They have no idea. They have no idea what they're doing. It's just a left-wing rant.
Okay. Barry, are you unmuted yet?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, one quick last question.
Okay, first of all, I want to say to your guest speaker and your audience, David, our sympathies from Israel for your government. Sympathy and shock. If it's any compensation to you people down under, you are not quite as bad yet as South Africa, who decided to take us to the International Court of Justice on genocide charges while representing the biggest genocidal Islamic terror organization in the world. But my double-edged question for your speaker, David, is two things. First of all, I've come up, because of my research of the Israel Institute of Strategic Studies, with a rational solution for the Gaza problem. And that is an Abraham Accords protectorate. I'm not going to go into any detail here. My questions are, A, one, is the Australian government in any way capable of coming up with a satisfactory solution for the problem we have here with Gaza? And secondly, with regard to your guest speaker, is there anything that you people can do over there to change your government?
Well, the Australian government doesn't offer anything but a cliche on the solution to this overall problem. So when the Foreign Minister Penny Wong has been in Israel and in the Palestinian territories recently, she very gravely and very sullenly stands in front of the TV cameras and says the Australian government calls for a two-state solution. Hang on. There was a resolution in the United Nations in 1947 which called for a two-state solution. Everybody's calling for a two-state solution, but just having a press conference and very gravely saying that it's just politics. It doesn't mean, and it's meaningless. So you're quite right. I mean, I haven't seen your proposal. The Abraham Accords, the relationships with the moderate Arab states, this is the path forward, in my view. This is the only path forward for the Israelis in dealing with the Palestinian problem. There's a huge amount that can be said about that. You're right to condemn the South African government. I think the Australian government should have done so as well. I think their behaviour is just preposterous. I mean, honestly, they should look in the mirror down there in South Africa at what they've done to the economy. They don't even have power 24 hours a day. The per capita GDP of the country has progressively been declining. It's been falling down the scale of prosperous nations in the world. Because of the corruption and the abominable way it's been run, particularly under President Zuma, if not the present President Ramaphosa, Cyril Ramaphosa. But you know, they should leave this issue alone and concentrate on their own problems. So it's hugely disappointing. And I think the British and the US governments have been quite right to condemn this abuse of the international legal processes and the abuse of the International Court of Justice. But the Australian government hasn't done that. The Australian government just shrugs its shoulders and said, well, the law must take its course. Well, the law should not be abused, I'd say. The law should not be abused. It's a preposterous thing for them, South Africans, to have done. Can we do anything about the Australian government? Every 3 years we have a general election in Australia. I actually, unlike many of you, I have never voted for the Labor Party. What I would say to people now that I'm not involved in politics anymore, or not in politics anymore, is whether you're a bit Labour or a bit Liberal or whatever you are, make sure people don't vote for the Greens. Get people, particularly young people who are, through history, have voted for ideological political movements, as we know. I mean, if you're Jewish, you'll know all about the way young people voted in the 1930s in Germany. And the role of the universities, the role of the teachers, the role of the youth voters through the late 20s and into the 1930s. So you get young people away from voting for ideological parties, and in the case of Australia, get them away from voting for the anti-Semitic Green Party.
Yeah, I think that's a very good message to end on. That's something we've been promoting a lot, that everyone should be pressured, Labour and the Teals, to put the Greens last. And yeah, they're just a terrible, terrible party. Thank you so much, Mr. Downer. Thank you for your time, for a fascinating talk. Sorry to everyone we didn't get can see so many hands raised for questions. Next week, we'll make sure to get to some people that haven't asked before. We'll go to you guys first. Thank you so much, Alexander Downer, for an amazing talk, and for your services, Foreign Minister. David, would you like to add some words?
Look, Alexander, we're honoured to have you as our guest tonight. Very much appreciate your sentiments. We do like people who are principled and have values, and you fall into that category. And I hope that you have the ear of some senior people in the Liberal Party still. And yes, we are doing some things to promote and call out issues. I'll just show people very briefly one of them. This is a meme created from Advance Australia. Advance Australia ran the No campaign for the referendum, and I should declare that I am on the board of Advance Australia. Might have something to do with this particular message, but the Middle East policy, and particularly giving foreign aid in a manner where it can be diverted inappropriately, may well be a bit of an election issue in 18 months' time. So thank you so much, Alexander Downer, and I hope we can keep in touch.
Certainly. It's been a great pleasure.
Okay, good night all.